Welcome, dear viewers, to a heartwarming tale of second chances, unexpected heroism, and the transformative power of love in the high-stakes world of fine dining. Enjoy the story. The crisp winter air nipped at George Hartley's cheeks as he paced back and forth in the nearly deserted city park. At 47, he cut an impressive figure salt and pepper hair artfully tousled, a tailored wool coat hugging his still athletic frame. To any passerby, he looked every inch the successful businessman he was. But right now, none of that mattered. His 5-year-old grandson, Paul, had vanished. "Yes, Jenny, I've got him," George lied into his phone, trying to keep the panic from his voice as he spoke to his daughter. "We're having a great time. I'll have him back by dinner, don't worry." He ended the call and frantically scanned the park. "Paul!" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Paul, where are you? This isn't funny anymore." George's mind raced. How could he have been so careless? One moment, Paul was gleefully chasing pigeons, and the next, gone. He cursed himself for getting distracted by that damned phone call. As he jogged towards the playground, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. George's heart stopped. He knew that voice. "Paul!" he yelled, breaking into a sprint towards the sound. It was coming from the direction of the river. George's feet pounded against the frozen ground as he raced towards the riverbank. His breath came in ragged gasps, forming small clouds in the frigid air. As he crested the small hill overlooking the water, his worst fears were realized. There, in the middle of a partially frozen section of the river, was Paul. The boy's small arms flailed wildly as he struggled to keep his head above the icy water. "Oh God, Paul!" George cried out, his mind blank with terror. He knew he'd never reach the boy in time. Suddenly, a blur of motion caught his eye. A woman, bundled in a threadbare coat, was dashing across the ice. She moved with surprising agility, her feet barely touching the slippery surface as she made her way towards Paul. George watched in awe and terror as the stranger reached his grandson. With strength that belied her slight frame, she plunged her arms into the frigid water and hauled Paul out. The ice creaked ominously beneath them as she began to inch her way back to shore, cradling the soaking wet child against her chest. By the time George reached the water's edge, the woman had almost made it. He waded in, heedless of the bone-chilling cold, and helped them onto solid ground. "Paul, oh thank God!" George sobbed, gathering the shivering boy into his arms. He turned to the woman who was now trembling violently, her clothes soaked through. You saved him. I can't thank you enough." The woman attempted a smile, her teeth chattering too much to speak. George made a split-second decision. "Come with us quickly. We need to get you both warm." Without waiting for a response, he scooped up Paul and gestured for the woman to follow. They hurried towards his parked Mercedes, leaving wet footprints in their wake. The opulent foyer of George's mansion was soon awash with frantic activity. Olivia, the ever-efficient housekeeper, whisked Paul away to a hot bath, leaving George alone with the mystery woman who had saved his grandson's life. "The bathroom's just down the hall," George said, gesturing. "There are plenty of towels, and I'll have Olivia bring you some dry clothes." The woman nodded gratefully and disappeared into the bathroom. George paced nervously, his mind reeling from the day's events. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And how could he ever repay her for what she'd done? 15 minutes later, they were seated in the plush living room, steaming mugs of tea warming their hands. The woman, now dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame, looked around the room with barely concealed awe. "I'm George," he said, breaking the silence. "And you are?" "Helen," she replied softly. "Helen Reeves." "Helen, I can't thank you enough for what you did. If there's anything I can do to repay you—" Helen's eyes dropped to her lap. "Actually," she said hesitantly, "I've been looking for work. I don't suppose you know of any openings, anything at all?" George leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Helen's laugh was tinged with bitterness. "At this point, anything. No one seems to want to hire an ex-con." The words hung in the air between them. George's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but to his credit, his expression quickly softened into one of compassion. "Ex-con?" he probed gently. Helen nodded, her shoulders slumping. Got out 2 months ago. First and only offense, I swear. But it doesn't matter. One look at my record and every door slams shut. George leaned back, considering. He thought of Paul, safe and warm upstairs, all thanks to this woman. Ex-con or not, she'd risked her life without hesitation. That had to count for something. Well, he said slowly, as it happens, I do know of an opening. How do you feel about restaurants? The hustle and bustle of the kitchen at Hartley's, George's upscale restaurant, was a far cry from the sterile quiet of Helen's recent past. She moved through the organized chaos with a sense of purpose, her eyes bright and alert as she absorbed every detail of her new environment. George watched her from the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. He'd taken a chance on Helen, starting her as a kitchen assistant. And so far, she was exceeding all expectations. She approached each task, no matter how menial, with a focus and determination that impressed even his veteran staff. As the weeks passed, George found himself spending more and more time in the kitchen, ostensibly to oversee operations, but in reality to observe Helen. There was something about her, a hidden depth, a flicker of expertise that seemed at odds with her position as a novice kitchen hand. His suspicions were confirmed one hectic Friday evening. The restaurant was packed, reservations spilling over into the bar area. In the midst of the dinner rush, George noticed Helen confidently step up to one of the cooking stations, effortlessly taking over for an overwhelmed line cook. Her movements were fluid, precise. She handled the pans with the ease of a seasoned chef, expertly plating dishes that looked like works of art. George's jaw dropped. Who was this woman? As the night wound down and the last customers trickled out, George approached Helen, who was wiping down her station. That was quite a performance, he said, causing her to start slightly. Where did you learn to cook like that? Helen's cheeks flushed, and she avoided his gaze. Oh, picked up a few things here and there. George raised an eyebrow. A few things? Helen, what I saw tonight was years of professional experience. Why didn't you tell me you were a trained chef? Helen's shoulders slumped, and when she finally met his eyes, the pain he saw there made his heart ache. Because, she said softly, that part of my life is over. Or at least, I thought it was. George's office was uncharacteristically chaotic. Papers were strewn across his usually immaculate desk, and he paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, Senator, I understand the importance. Of course, we'd be honored. This Friday? Yes, we'll make it work. He ended the call and slumped into his chair, running a hand through his hair. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Come in, he called out, straightening up. Arthur, his head chef and old friend, limped in, his leg encased in a bulky cast. Hey, George, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's up? George groaned. Senator Williams is coming for dinner on Friday, with a delegation of foreign diplomats. Arthur whistled low. Big fish. But we can handle it, right? I'm laid up, but the team? That's just it, George interrupted. The senator has requested a special menu, fusion cuisine with elements from each diplomat's home country. It's not our usual fare, Art. I'm not sure we can pull it off. Arthur's face fell. Damn, that is a pickle. Have you told the staff yet? George shook his head. I'm about to. I don't know what we're going to do. Moments later, the kitchen staff was gathered, faces a mix of excitement and apprehension, as George explained the situation. So, he concluded, I'm open to any ideas. How do we make this work? A heavy silence fell over the group. Then a quiet voice spoke up from the back. I might be able to help. All heads turned to see Helen, looking nervous but determined. You? One of the line cooks scoffed. No offense, but you're just a kitchen assistant. George held up a hand to silence the murmurs. Go on, Helen. What did you have in mind? Helen took a deep breath. If I could see the guest list and their dietary preferences, I think I could put together a menu that would work. I have some experience with international cuisine. The room erupted in whispers. George studied Helen intently, his mind racing. Could this be the solution they needed? All right, he said finally. Show us what you've got. The kitchen fell silent as Helen pored over the guest list, her brow furrowed in concentration. The staff watched in a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she scribbled notes, muttering to herself. Finally, she looked up. "Okay, I think I have something." For the next hour, Helen outlined a menu that left everyone, including George, stunned. She deftly wove together elements from each diplomat's cuisine, creating innovative fusion dishes that sounded mouth-watering. For the appetizer, we'll do a deconstructed sushi roll, but with a Middle Eastern twist. Saffron-infused rice topped with seared tuna and a pomegranate reduction. As she spoke, George watched the skepticism on his staff's faces melt into admiration. Even Arthur, listening in via speakerphone, sounded impressed. When Helen finished, the kitchen erupted into excited chatter. George quieted them with a raised hand. "Helen," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. "This is incredible, but I have to ask, how? Where did you learn all this?" Helen's face fell, and she seemed to shrink into herself. I think we should talk privately, Mr. Hartley." George nodded, leading her to his office. As the door closed behind them, he turned to face her. "All right, Helen, I think it's time you told me the whole story." Helen sank into a chair, her eyes fixed on her hands. "I used to own a restaurant," she began softly. "A good one. It was my dream, my whole life." As Helen's story unfolded, George listened in stunned silence. She told him about her rise in the culinary world, her marriage to a fellow restaurateur, the birth of her son, and then the embezzlement, the threats, the tragic death of her child. "I lost everything," Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My son, my restaurant, my freedom. When I got out of prison, I swore I'd never step foot in a kitchen again. But then you saved Paul," George finished softly. Helen nodded. "And you gave me a chance. I'd forgotten how much I loved this world, how much I missed it." George leaned forward, taking Helen's hands in his. "Helen, I am so sorry for everything you've been through, but I want you to know you have a place here, not just as a kitchen assistant, but as a chef, if you want it." For the first time since he'd met her, Helen's smile reached her eyes. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Hartley." "George," he corrected gently. "Call me George." The night of the senator's dinner arrived, and Hartley's was abuzz with nervous energy. In the kitchen, Helen moved with quiet confidence, directing the staff with the ease of a seasoned conductor leading an orchestra. George watched from the sidelines, marveling at the transformation. Gone was the timid kitchen assistant. In her place stood a master chef, completely in her element. As the first dishes left the kitchen, a hush fell over the dining room. George held his breath, waiting for the reaction. And then, "Exquisite," Senator Williams's booming voice carried to the kitchen. "Simply exquisite. Who is responsible for this culinary masterpiece?" George beamed with pride as he approached the table. "Senator, distinguished guests, I'm pleased to introduce you to our chef for this evening, Helen Reeves." Helen emerged from the kitchen, her cheeks flushed with exertion and excitement. As she described each dish to the enthralled diners, George couldn't take his eyes off her. She was radiant, confident, alive in a way he'd never seen before. The evening was an unqualified success. As the last of the guests departed, full of praise and promises to return, George found Helen in the kitchen, supervising the cleanup. "Helen," he said softly, causing her to turn. "That was incredible. You're incredible." Helen blushed, ducking her head. "Thank you, George, for everything, for giving me this chance." As their eyes met, George felt a flutter in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply smiled, wondering at the new feelings stirring within him. Weeks turned into months, and Helen's star continued to rise at Hartley's. Under her guidance, the restaurant's reputation soared to new heights. But as Helen flourished, George found himself increasingly distracted. He caught himself watching her as she worked, admiring the grace of her movements, the passion in her eyes as she created new dishes. More than once, he had to shake himself out of a daydream, wondering what it would be like to hold her, to kiss her. One evening, as they worked late going over the books, George finally gathered his courage. "Helen," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "I was wondering if you might like to have dinner with me sometime. Not here, I mean. Somewhere else. Just the two of us." Helen looked up, surprise and something else. Was it fear? Flashing in her eyes. "Oh, George, I don't think that would be a good idea." George's heart sank. "May I ask why not?" Helen sighed, setting down her pen. "You're my boss, George. And more than that, you. Successful, respected. I'm an ex-con with a past I can never fully escape. It wouldn't be right." "Helen, I don't care about any of that," George protested. "I care about you, the person you are now." But Helen shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, George, I just can't." As she gathered her things and left, George slumped in his chair, wondering how something that felt so right could be so complicated. George's friend Arthur found him in his office, staring morosely at a glass of whiskey. "All right, spill it," Arthur demanded, settling into a chair. "What's got you looking like someone canceled Christmas?" George sighed, recounting his failed attempt to ask Helen out. Arthur listened thoughtfully, then leaned forward with a gleam in his eye. "You know," he said slowly, "there might be a way to show Helen that you see her as an equal. That restaurant of hers, it's still on the market, isn't it?" George's eyes widened as he caught on to Arthur's plan. "Art, you're a genius!" The next few weeks were a flurry of secret activity. George worked tirelessly, pulling strings and calling in favors. He had a vision, and he was determined to see it through. Finally, everything was in place. One evening, as Helen was closing up the kitchen, George approached her, trying to keep his excitement in check. "Helen, I was hoping you might join me for a short drive. There's something I'd like to show you." Helen hesitated, clearly remembering their last private conversation. But curiosity got the better of her, and she nodded. "All right, George, lead the way." As they drove through the city, Helen grew increasingly puzzled. "George, this neighborhood, it's where my old restaurant was." George simply smiled, guiding the car around one last corner. And there it was, Helen's old restaurant, but not as she remembered it. The dilapidated building she'd last seen was gone, replaced by a gleaming facade, and above the door, in elegant script, were the words, "Helen's Place." Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "George, what? What is this?" George parked the car and turned to her, his heart pounding. "It's yours, Helen, if you want it. I bought the building, renovated it. It's ready to open whenever you are." Tears welled up in Helen's eyes as she stared at the restaurant, her restaurant. "But why?" she whispered. George took a deep breath. "Because you deserve it, Helen. Because you're an incredible chef and an even more incredible person. And because I love you." Helen turned to him, her eyes wide with shock. "You love me?" George nodded, reaching out to take her hand. "I do. And I know you think we can't be together because of our different backgrounds. But Helen, don't you see? This levels the playing field. You're not my employee anymore. You're my equal. Always have been, really." Helen's lips trembled as she looked from George to the restaurant and back again. "Oh, George," she breathed. "I love you too. I have for so long, but I was so afraid." George cupped her face gently. "No more fear, Helen. What do you say? Will you take a chance on us?" In answer, Helen leaned in and kissed him, pouring all her pent-up emotion into it. When they finally parted, both were breathless and grinning like teenagers. "Is that a yes?" George asked teasingly. Helen laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes, George, to all of it. The restaurant, us, yes." The grand opening of Helen's Place was the talk of the town. Food critics raved about the innovative menu, the elegant ambiance, and the inspiring story of its owner's comeback. In the bustling kitchen, Helen moved with confidence and grace, directing her staff with the expertise of a seasoned pro. Through the service window, she caught George's eye as he charmed the diners, every bit the suave restaurateur. As the last plates were cleared and the staff began to clean up, George slipped into the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around Helen from behind, planting a soft kiss on her neck. "So, Chef Reeves, how does it feel to be back on top?" Helen turned in his arms, her eyes shining with happiness. "It feels amazing, Mr. Hartley. But do you know the best part?" "What's that?" "Knowing that no matter what happens out there," she gestured to the dining room, "I have you to come home to." George's heart swelled with love. "Always," he promised, sealing it with a kiss. As they walked hand in hand out of the restaurant, both knew that they had found the perfect recipe, not just for success, but for love. Their pasts had brought them together, and now their future stretched out before them, as rich and full of possibility as a 5-course meal at Helen's place.